As the hot morning sun rises over the Gettysburg battlefield, the two armies stand in position, ready for a third day's fight. The Federal Army of the Potomac, commanded by George Gordon Meade, awaits, as his opponent, Robert E. Lee, and his Army of Northern Virginia stood a mile away on the other side of the field. Lee, who was fighting an offensive campaign, needed his battle of decision for ultimate Confederate victory and putting an end to the war. His plan called for 150 cannons to be placed on Seminary Ridge and bombard 90 Union cannons on Cemetery Ridge and soften up the Federal line. It became the greatest artillery duel in American history. The duel lasted from 1 o'clock in the afternoon until 3 p.m., in which afterwards Confederate infantrymen under General George Pickett charged across the open terrain to the clump of trees on Cemetery Ridge. At the same time, Confederate cavalry under the command of Major General Jeb Stuart were intercepted and defeated by Union cavalry under Brigadier General David Gregg and George Armstrong Custer 3 miles east of Gettysburg near Low Dutch Road. Out of the 75,000 Confederates engaged at Gettysburg, Lee lost 28,063 men. Meade, who had 97,000 men, lost 23,049. Losses of the 3 days fighting totaled 51,112 men and approximately 11,000 horses and mules. It marked the bloodiest fighting of the American Civil War. The shattered buildings and dead of thousands of slain soldiers and horses lay rotting on the ground as the hot July heat caused the bodies to swell 3 times their normal size, and the stench of death permeated the air. Virtually every house, barn, and building in Gettysburg was used as a hospital for the 24,000 wounded that remained in the town. Later on, Camp Letterman General Hospital along the York Pike became a large city within itself, as approximately 400 tents housed the wounded until November of the same year. Within 2 weeks after the fighting, plans were made by local citizens to preserve the land. The president of the Evergreen Cemetery Association had made intentions to honor the Union dead. The ground adjacent to the local cemetery could be used for this purpose and honor these men on the same ground in which they fought. Only the bodies of the Union soldiers were disinterred and placed in the National Cemetery. Confederates were considered traitors and would not be buried with these honored dead. 3,512 bodies were to be buried in this key position of the Union line. On November 19, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln came to the cemetery's dedication and gave his famous speech that would live forever in American history, the Gettysburg Address. As the Southern dead were buried last on the field, shallow graves littered the landscape with signs of where the invaders laid in final rest. In 1879, the Southern Ladies Memorial Organization came to remove the Confederate slain and take them back to their homeland in the South. In 1864, local citizens formed the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association and acquired only Union-held land and secured ownership of 70 acres. In 1895, they purchased over 500 acres. By February 1896, the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association abolished its organization and deeded its 522 acres to the U.S. War Department, and the land was designated the Gettysburg National Military Park. Today, the Gettysburg National Military Park is made up of over 5 square miles of land as the battlefield itself surrounds the entire town. As the park started to take form, monuments began to emerge as the 2nd Massachusetts placed the battlefield's first regimental monument on Culp's Hill. No roads have yet been placed to Culp's Hill as of 1882. To the men of the 2nd Massachusetts, the Battle of Gettysburg consisted of an ill-fated charge across Spangler's Meadow to dislodge Confederates from the works that they had captured the night before. 316 men charged over the works, leaving the field littered with the regiment's casualties, including their colonel. As the monument was erected on the land bought from the Spangler family, the dedication of the monument in 1879 became the first one erected on the battlefield. A plaque on this monument contains the names of the 41 enlisted men and 4 officers that lost their lives in that action. The only regimental monument built by a Confederate veterans group was the 1st Maryland Battalion. On 1884, the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association granted permission to the survivors of the 1st Maryland Confederate States of America to erect a memorial to their position on the field. This unit was successful in several assaults on Union positions until the entire Confederate line was repulsed on July 3rd. But as there were 2 Union Maryland regiments in similar positions during the battle, so the inscription was changed to read 2nd Maryland CSA to avoid confusion with the Union regiments with similar numerical designations. Dedicated on November 19, 1886, the addition to the inscription formerly 1st Maryland CSA was later added on. By the year's end, regimental organizations placed 47 monuments on the field. In 1888, more than 200 markers dotted the field as flank markers told the position of each unit who fought at Gettysburg. By 1895, 320 monuments of Union troops have been placed on this field of honor. Today, approximately 1,400 outdoor stone and bronze sculptures and markers ornate the Gettysburg National Military Park. It was designed to become an outdoor art gallery surpassed only by the Mall in nearby Washington, D.C. The veterans of the battle placed these memorials to tell their stories to future generations. As the park continued to develop, over 60 monuments were moved to different positions as roadways tore into the countryside and controversy began to emerge between veteran organizations and the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association. One example of this is the monument of Battery K of the 1st New York Light Artillery located where Pleasanton Avenue now lays. The left and right flank markers show the position of the battery, and photographic evidence shows the marker in place. Today, the flank markers still stand in the same position, but the monument has been relocated to a different spot north on the field, as it would stand in the middle of Pleasanton Avenue otherwise. One of the biggest monumental mysteries of the field is these markers by the famous copse of trees. Signs designate the positions of the 19th, 15th, and 20th Massachusetts. Several hundred feet away, the regimental monuments stand in a different area of the field. The reason is this: the correct placement of the regimental monuments was usually achieved through joint cooperation of the unit's Veteran Association and the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association. Occasionally, disagreements occurred between the two groups. Because of the possibility of the angle of Pickett's charge being overwhelmed with monuments, the Memorial Association ruled that all monuments were to be located in the established line of battle prior to the famous charge. During the battle, Pickett's men rushed over the famous wall, and the 72nd Pennsylvania, who was in line near what is now Hancock Avenue, rushed up to aid in throwing the enemy back. The survivors of the regiment insisted that their monument be placed at the forward position 20 feet from the wall. After purchasing a plot of ground from the Cadore family, still privately owned at the time, survivors proceeded to dig a foundation. This marked the beginning of a fight that would last for 3 years. The placement of this monument took to the legal system to decide the issue. The court ruled against the 72nd Pennsylvania. Determined to build their monument on the stone wall, appeals were filed as the issue ended up in the hands of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of the 72nd Pennsylvania. This ruling allowed the 72nd to erect their monument in 1891. Showing a figure of a soldier clubbing his musket illustrated the closeness of the struggle that had taken place at the angle. This monument was dedicated in 1891. As predicted, the monuments of the 19th, 20th, and 15th Massachusetts were moved to their secondary position on the battle line, and other monuments as well began to sprout up along the wall. Another monument to share the same fate of this monumental mystery is the 106th Pennsylvania. This unit aided in repulsing the attack of Wright's Confederate Brigade on the afternoon of July 2nd, capturing 1 colonel and 250 officers and men. With the attack on East Cemetery Hill in the evening, the 106th was shifted to defend the Union batteries. On July 3rd, the main body of the regiment was in position near the angle when Pickett's charge was launched. As the 106th and the 72nd Pennsylvania charged to the fence, meeting the advancing rebels, hand-to-hand combat left many fatally wounded lying on the field. The roll call of July 4th found 8 men present for duty in companies B and C. In 1882, the regiment placed a marker on East Cemetery Hill. 3 years later, the Regiment Veterans Association erected another monument near the copse of trees. When state monument appropriations became available, the men chose to use the funds to erect a more substantial monument on this spot. The unit then moved the original marker to the Gadori House, where the regiment charged on July 2nd, recapturing several cannons of Brown's Rhode Island Battery, and the colonel, 5 captains, 15 lieutenants, and 250 men of the 48th Georgia Infantry. On September 11, 1889, the current monument of the 106th was dedicated in front of the historic copse of trees. Playing a defensive role in the battle, the 96th Pennsylvania was not engaged during the 3 days fighting at Gettysburg. Placed in position on July 2nd, they remained vigilant and ready to engage the enemy if the need arose. The statue of the prone infantryman watches for signs of the enemy along the Wheatfield Road. Dedicated on June 21, 1888, this photo shows the soldier seeking the protection of the ground, facing the opposite direction of which it presently faces. Take note of the number 96 in this photo and the direction the soldier is facing, compared to the present-day position of the same view. You can see that the top portion of the monument was reversed from its original position. The monument of the 93rd Pennsylvania bears the cross of the 6th Corps and was the first of its corps to see action in Gettysburg. As the regiment crossed the state line into Pennsylvania, the men began singing "Home Sweet Home" as they marched to the quick step and unfurled their colors. Just to the Union right of the Round Tops on July 2nd, the 93rd contested the advancing rebel line and drove them back, taking 25 prisoners. The original monument, dedicated on October 3, 1884, stood in this position for nearly 4 years. Notice the ridge in the background of this photograph of the 1884 dedication in comparison to this photograph taken in 1888. A different monument occupies the same spot on the boulder, surrounded by the survivors of the unit. The original monument was moved to a secondary position on Sedgwick Avenue, where the regiment stood on July 2nd and 3rd. Also, note the split rocks that the original monument sat upon. The carvings on the boulder were removed as the new monument took its spot on the field. Knapp's Battery E of the Pennsylvania Independent Light Artillery was first placed a little to the rear of Cemetery Hill on July 1st, then moved to Culp's Hill under the command of Lieutenant E.R. Geary. On July 2nd, the unit was placed on Powers Hill to engage Confederate guns on Benner's Hill. Dedicated on October 13, 1885, a single monument was erected on the highest point where the Culp's Hill Tower now stands. In 1897, the tower was erected. The monument was moved only a few yards away to its current site. In 1889, with funds allocated by the state of Pennsylvania, this monument was raised and placed on a higher stone base. It is believed that this beautiful artillery memorial stood beside the smaller one. Now, on Powers Hill, the larger monument was mistakenly dedicated in 1885 in the wrong place. The inscription on this monument reads, "At 3:30 p.m. on July 2nd, one gun was placed on Culp's Hill in the position marked by the small monument, and the others at 5 p.m. These guns were withdrawn and the battery went into position where it remained till the close of battle." According to the dedication speech, they were located on Powers Hill instead of Culp's Hill during the ceremony. The foundation rock base of the larger monument suggests that it once stood in the same spot where the smaller one stood, and perhaps moved to Powers Hill after the smaller was moved to make room for the tower. Little Round Top also bears many monumental changes. The monument to the 91st Pennsylvania, dedicated in 1889, stood on the top of the hill. A smaller monument occupied the same spot until the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania appropriated funds for monuments to all state regiments that fought in the battle. The original monument was moved behind the current and much larger one and bears the inscription PVV, meaning Pennsylvania Veteran Volunteers. The Pennsylvania Monument, which is the largest monument on the field, honors all men of the Keystone State who fought in Gettysburg. Begun in the fall of 1907, the monument was dedicated in 1910. Atop of the monument is the statue Winged Victory, weighing 7,500 pounds and made from melted down bronze cannons from the war. Tablets of the names of those Pennsylvanians who fought at Gettysburg are cast on the bottom. The names were taken from the rosters of the original Army payroll forms of June 30th, 1863. Of the 34,530 veterans inscribed on the tablets, 35 of them were removed as deserters, soldiers who later in the war became absent without leave, died in previous battles, or were just not present at all at Gettysburg. Several rock carvings were placed on the battlefield after the conflict ended, some placed by veterans of the battle to commemorate the spot where they and their comrades fought on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd in 1863. The carvings on Little Round Top are probably the most well-known on the field as the spot marked where Colonel Strong Vincent was mortally wounded on July 2nd, and reveals itself as the setting sun brings this stone to life. There is controversy as to whether or not this is the place, or if another marked area yards away are really the place where Vincent received his mortal wound. Also on Little Round Top is a carving to mark the spot where General Stephen Weed was killed by a sharpshooter's bullet. Placed on the back side of the 91st Pennsylvania Volunteer Veterans Monument boulder, this carving also tells the story where Lieutenant Hazlitt, who came to render aid to the wounded general, also suffered the same fate from the Confederate guns below in Devil's Den. Devil's Den also plays host to several rock carvings. Some may easily be found as others remain hidden to the untrained eye. A carving to the 4th Maine is one that may have been used to mark the spot of the regiment's actions prior to the monument being erected. Placed in front of the regimental monument, the 4th Maine carving remains ornately carved in the granite rock previously hidden for years by a bush. On top of the rock formation, the words P. Knoll appear ornately carved only feet from the 4th New York Artillery Monument. Park Knoll is documented as a rock carver and perhaps carved information on some of these monuments during the 1880s while they were being constructed. Before leaving Gettysburg, he left his mark. Culp's Hill has one special rock carving that gives a complete name of a Confederate soldier who returned to Gettysburg around 1914. A. Coble of the 1st North Carolina Regiment carved his name in the position where he perhaps spent long, frightening hours crouched behind these boulders on those hot July days in 1863. The carving is now eroded and barely visible to the untrained eye. In the year 1913, over 55,000 veterans came to Gettysburg to participate in a massive reunion celebrating the 50th anniversary of the battle. One outcome of this reunion was to construct a lasting symbol of peace and unity of the nation. Another 25 years would pass before this symbol would become a reality. On July 3rd, 1938, the last reunion of Civil War veterans, dedication ceremonies took place of the Peace Light Memorial. 1,800 Civil War veterans from ages 88 to 112 years old watched as President Franklin D. Roosevelt dedicated the monument. A gas flame was ignited by veterans of the Union and Confederacy as an eternal sign of peace between North and South. In 1917, the first Southern State Monument was dedicated on the Confederate side of the field. The Virginia Monument bears the likeness of General Robert E. Lee on top of his favorite Mount Traveler. This started an outcropping of Confederate state monuments, which continued to emerge until the year 2000, the last being the 11th Mississippi. A moratorium on monuments is now in effect. By 1880, the area's farm property began to change. Spangler Spring became a picnic area with 2 springs that gave refreshing water to horses and visitors alike. Some farm areas were sold and buildings were torn down or rebuilt after the battle. The Cadore Barn, which stood in the middle of Pickett's charge, was said to have been the spot where General George Pickett observed his division decimated during his famous frontal assault on July 3rd. The barn, which had held prisoners after the action, was torn down and later rebuilt into a considerably larger structure as seen today. The Lister Farm, which became headquarters of Union Commander General George Meade, was struck by artillery during the Confederate assault on July 3rd. Having abandoned the building, Meade moved to Powers Hill, where he directed Federal artillery for the rest of the battle. A 2.5-story addition was added and later removed to its present state. The Lister Farm remains much today as it appeared in 1863. On July 1st, the Confederate Army took over the town of Gettysburg. House-to-house fighting riddles buildings and fences with bullet holes as the Union Army retreated through the town up Baltimore Street. The Samuel McCreary House on Baltimore Street marked the advanced position of the Confederate skirmish line on Cemetery Hill. Soldiers from Louisiana occupied the McCreary House and its twin, the Weinbrenner House, as a Corporal Poole was killed by Union forces while shooting from the balcony doorway of the McCreary House. Bullet holes attest to the severity of the fire, as a statement from Lieutenant J.W. Jackson of the 8th Louisiana attests. If anyone showed himself or had a hat was seen above the fence, a volley was poured into us. Today, the McCreary House site is a small park in which visitors may sit in reflection of what they have learned of this terrible day of July in 1863. 4 months after the battle, the dedication of the National Cemetery on November 19th was in motion as the procession including President Abraham Lincoln moved up Baltimore Street. In the background of this photograph, the smokestack of John Rupp's tannery can be seen, and a clear view of dirt roads and houses marks the way. Today, the scene has changed considerably as a paved road, concrete sidewalks, and development change the original appearance of this historic part of town. East Cemetery Hill was the first to receive a wooden lattice structure erected just in time for the 1878 Grand Army of the Republic Reunion, a Union veterans organization. Big Round Top had a 40-foot wooden tower constructed in 1870 and replaced by a metal 60-foot structure in 1895. By 1879, 5 steel towers began to crop up over the landscape, giving the visitors a bird's-eye view. The tower on West Confederate Avenue was the first, as the Variety Iron Works of Cleveland, Ohio built the tall steel structures on Big Round Top, Culp's Hill, Oak Ridge, and Ziegler's Grove. The towers on Culp's Hill and Big Round Top marked the flanks of the Union line. The tower on Oak Ridge and West Confederate Avenue indicated the general flanks of the Confederate line. In 1895, the wooden tower on East Cemetery Hill yielded its position to the new equestrian statue of General Winfield Scott Hancock. By the late 1960s, 3 of the steel structures were demolished as the Big Round Top Tower disappeared in 1968, the Oak Ridge Tower was cut down to half size in 1895, and the Cemetery Ridge Tower made way for the new Cyclorama building in 1963. The only remaining towers standing today are the Culp's Hill Tower, the tower on West Confederate Avenue, and the half tower on Oak Ridge. In 1882, the Gettysburg and Harrisburg Railroad was extended using the unfinished railroad cut through Oak Ridge. This meant that access to the town by visitors now became easier. An electric trolley line threatened historic ground, and in 1893, rocks and boulders that once shielded Union and Confederate soldiers from deadly projectiles were removed from this sacred ground as construction moved the earth from Devil's Den, the Valley of Death, to the fields of Pickett's Charge. The trolley line ran from the Carlisle Street station through the town square to Baltimore Street and the Baltimore Pike to the town limits and joined the Gettysburg and Harrisburg tracks to Little Round Top. The other part of the line went from Washington Street Station to Steinwehr Avenue and the town limits to the Emmitsburg Road to the Peach Orchard, where it turned into the battlefield to the wheat field. It then made a semicircle and turned into the Devil's Den and moved to the bottom of Little Round Top and intersected to Sedgwick Avenue and the Wheatfield Road. In 1897, approval for purchase and removal of the trolley was made for a total of $30,000, and the trolley was dismantled. Portions of the old trolley roadbeds can still be seen on the west side of Little Round Top, and also what is now a hiking trail west of Devil's Den. The scarred boulders along the face of Little Round Top still remain as evidence of the destruction of this historic land by commercial enterprise. Near the turn of the century, most visitors arrived at Gettysburg by train. Still, the most often used transportation method was to rent a horse and buggy, and their stay was usually 2 to 3 days. The Memorial Association began to build lanes in 1882, which became the present-day Hancock Avenue, to handle the traffic. Originally, the lane was called Main or Round Top Avenue and named Hancock Avenue in 1887. In those early days, most land of the battlefield was privately owned, and the Memorial Association sought to acquire the right-of-way. Hancock Avenue was really a strip of land ranging from 60 feet to 300 feet in width, all the way to the round tops. As the invention of automobiles made travel more accessible, the call for new roads became a reality. The first place to receive new roads was the Soldiers' National Cemetery in 1884 and paid for by the War Department. These roads were at first dirt roads constructed to handle the horse and buggy, but later were replaced by Telford avenues to help automobile traffic. From 1895 to 1933, the construction of these Telford roads improved travel. A base foundation of 8-inch wedge-like stones set on edge were topped with 4 inches of stone, 1.5 inches of quarter stone, and rolled with a 14-ton roller. Some of these Telford roads still exist under the modern-day asphalt roads today. Presently, there are 51 avenues in the Gettysburg National Military Park. All totaled, there have been 67 constructed since 1864, the last constructed in 1916. Today, some of the roads are walking paths for modern visitors. New paved roads now mark the way of travel as the early visitors slowly diminished into the past and more modern vehicles travel their course. Sykes Avenue was one of these roads. Constructed in 1897, these avenues were named after prominent officers of the battle. The onlooker who visits the sites during the right season can still see the landscapes of these old routes of travel. In 1886, the 155th Pennsylvania Monument was placed on Little Round Top and became a key stop on the auto tour. The base of the 155th was placed in 1886. The granite statue of a soldier wearing the Zouave uniform of the 155th was placed atop the monument in 1889, 3 years later. Today, this position is no longer a driving path, but overgrown by grass as the road was taken out. Another road that has changed in appearance was the road to Chamberlain Avenue. Constructed in 1902, the road ran a length of 1,050 feet. The evidence is in the photograph as the road was removed and replaced by another in the 1930s. Some of the original road beds on top of the hill are now used as walking paths. The parking lot of Big Round Top was one of the alterations that took place in the 1940s as the original walking paths used by the veterans of the battle were covered and new walkways were constructed. Evidence of the old pathways and steps can still be seen today to a knowledgeable investigator. Visitors who today take the modern route miss some of the monuments that the veterans passed on this trek up the steep slopes of Big Round Top. Flank markers and the monument to the 118th Pennsylvania are missed, and a larger monument to the 20th Maine is seen on the slopes of the hill as breastwork and monuments to the 12th Pennsylvania Reserve appear at the top. By 1883, nobody visited Pickett's Charge, as what was to become Hancock Avenue had not yet existed. By 1900, it was said that around 9,000 vehicles passed over Hancock Avenue in a single month, carrying 30,000 tourists. Development started to take over the unsecured land. Many new commercial ventures began to emerge over the battlefield. Private museums and souvenir shops began dotting the battlefield. Some were not removed until the late 1970s as the federal government purchased the land and the buildings. Once word spread that the federal government was taking over, speculators began buying land at a rate of $35 an acre and proposed selling it back to the Battlefield Commission at a rate of $400 an acre. The land around Devil's Den, however, was not part of the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association's holdings. Hoke's Ridge, as it was called, was a popular place for quarrying of Gettysburg granite. General Samuel Crawford, a veteran of the battle, noticed stonecutters blasting away at the rocks in the Valley of Death and was aroused at anger. As he looked upon this desecration with the current landowner, John Hoke, he offered to purchase and preserve the field in which he and his troops charged across in glory years ago. In 1878, Crawford bought 47 acres of the battlefield for $500. For the next 20 years, the land would be known as Crawford Park. In 1884, the Gettysburg-Harrisburg Railroad excursion line crossed the battlefield to a station near Little Round Top. The Little Round Top branch, completed in June of that year, saw the splitting of the rock on the field as 13 acres of track provided transportation to visitors as a pavilion, a kitchen with 2 ranges, and 2 wells with water started Round Top Park as a huge success. One part of that success story was the 13-acre property owned by photographer William Tipton, who in 1884 owned land between Little Round Top and Devil's Den. In 1888, a permanent photograph studio and eating facility with a table, water closet, and dancing floor was established by photographer Levi Mumper southeast of Plum Run. W.H. Tipton acquired the studio later on. As Devil's Den grew in popularity, graffiti appeared on the historic rocks as names and dates scarred the huge boulders. Locals seemed to do as much, if more damage than tourists. Crawford died in 1892, and the Gettysburg National Military Park bought the land in 1894 from Crawford's heirs. The government removed the carvings as white scars now marred the rocks where soldiers' blood once ran. Up to 3,000 visitors a weekend were said to be visiting this area, and the evaluation of the land sale included a $3,000 per year profit margin from this business venture, as well as the initial value of acreage according to its owner. Tipton placed the total land value between $20,000 to $30,000, but the condemnation proceedings only awarded him $6,150. The buildings were removed after Tipton accepted the award. By 1904, the Gettysburg-Harrisburg Railroad made the battlefield more accessible as over 440 regimental monuments marked the field. Gettysburg was becoming an outdoor art gallery as the land continued to become more and more valuable. Only 1,800 acres were in the Commission's hand at this point. The owner of the 11.5-acre peach orchard claimed that his land was worth $400 per acre because of its agriculture and historic value. The asking price of $4,600 was denied as the Commission paid $116.67 per acre, or a total of $1,341.70 for the property. By 1913, the 50th anniversary reunion saw many veterans return to the field once again. Peace and a reunited country was the theme as Spangler Springs now had water spigots, and as veterans of both North and South shared its cool water. As the United States entered World War I, the Gettysburg battlefield once again saw military service as an Army training facility called Camp Colt, named after Samuel Colt, the inventor of the Colt revolver, came into being. Having good rail transportation, men and goods were easily brought to and from the training area. Commanded by Captain Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Army base held the first Tank Corps maneuvers on this historic ground and trained nearly 9,000 men. By 1918, World War I had ended and Camp Colt folded. By 1933, the park was transferred from the War Department to the Department of the Interior and National Park Service. By this time, 23 miles of roads and 2,500 acres of land had become part of the park. As the government-owned land became used for purposes other than tourism, 2 civilian conservation corps camps emerged to house men who work on government-funded projects on the battlefield and in the area. Camp 1 was located in Pitzer's Woods, and Camp 2 in McMillan Woods. The CCC men worked both inside and outside the park, replacing stone fences, and working on farm lanes inside the park boundaries, replacing headstones in the cemetery. Camp 1 was struck in April of 1937, and Camp 2 soon followed in October. The land of the first day's fighting would not be purchased until 1930, as a biplane field occupied this sacred land since 1926. In 1936, fencing became another issue as the Commission constructed pipe fencing, or avenue fencing, to mark government-owned boundaries. Some of these pipe fences can still be seen today, as most have been removed in the 1940s. Some of the original stone fencing that marked farmers' property lines and were present during the battle were also reconstructed and still stand today. By 1940, some 2,500 acres were acquired, and automobiles were the primary means of transportation. Interpretive wayside markers were installed by 1941, and 10 years later, auto tour signs emerged along the roadways. The veterans of the battle were slowly fading away into history, and only about 10,000 remained to tell their experiences of the battle. Battlefield guides began taking over as the federal government licensed them in order to tell the correct story of the battle. 1938 saw the last reunion of the veterans during the 75th anniversary, as a new visitation record took place with 1,554,034 visitors roamed the fields and highways of Gettysburg. As the years grew, so did tourists and entrepreneurs took advantage of the growing crowds. Souvenir shops, motels, and hot dog stands took over the town as early as the 1960s, and our national shrine began being taken over by profiteers. Many realized that this commercialization threatened this historic land, and groups like the Gettysburg Battlefield Preservation Association and Friends of the Gettysburg National Military Park formed. Taking up fundraising, these groups began purchasing land and donating the proceeds to the Park Service in order to preserve the battlefield. A new visitor center and cyclorama emerged, but before the new cyclorama could be constructed, the iron observation tower that stood on this land since 1875 had to be removed. In 1970, another tower dominated the Gettysburg skyline when a 307-foot observation structure known as the Gettysburg National Tower opened to the public as a privately owned tourist attraction. It could be seen from almost every direction from the town and often used as a reference point by licensed battlefield guides. On July 3rd in the year 2000, the National Tower was removed so that the park could begin its plan to restore the battlefield to its original 1863 appearance. As the park continued to grow, vandals destroyed parts of the efforts of so many to preserve this historic park. In 1963, the 9-foot bronze statue of General G.W. Warren was toppled from its resting place since 1888. Park signs were removed, and more damage to statues continued to destroy the park. In the year 1879, cannons and markers began appearing on the hillsides of the battlefield. East Cemetery Hill was the first, as cannons and cannonballs marked the spot of artillery battery positions on the field. Old spoke tractor wheels were first used on the limbers, and later on, more sturdy steel carriages are used for the limbers as they are painted in 2 parts green and 1 part oak. The projectile pyramids illustrated what type of ammunition was fired from these pieces. These iron cannonballs began to disappear from theft, and as a result, the Park Service began taking the ball pyramids in order to preserve them. Of the 373 cannons that mark the field today, only 1 artillery battery remains the same, as it was when over 1,500 cannonballs accompanied the pieces and dotted the roadsides. Cannons were pushed off their foundations, and ornamentation of monuments fell victim to vandals as late as the 1990s. Taking advantage of the stone fence on Oak Hill, the 90th Pennsylvania was responsible for cutting down Iverson's North Carolinians about 2:20 in the afternoon on July 1st. Engaged in the heavy fighting of the first day's battle, the 90th Pennsylvania placed its memorial to their comrades on top of that hill. The 90th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry Monument was adorned with an ivy vine that clings onto the battle-torn tree that was shattered by artillery fire. Bronze accoutrements, a knapsack, and a rifled musket with canteen are slung over the trees as a nest of baby birds grace the top portion of the statue, symbolizing new life among death and destruction of the battlefield. In the late 1990s, vandals destroyed parts of this monument as the accoutrements were torn from this memorial in a reckless and thoughtless act of disrespect to those who fought, suffered, and died on this field of honor. By 1995, development began destroying the farmland that were used as hospitals during and after the battle. The hospital site of the 5th Corps was located 3 miles south of the battlefield on the Michael and Matilda Fissel farm. Fissel's large barn and small house were used for the injured of Vincent's 3rd Brigade. About 65 of the worst cases of the entire Corps were in that barn, as physicians were in attendance performing their duties to the fallen comrades. At least 186 burials were counted on this site, which was a spot along the edge of the woods overlooking a stream. In 1995, the land was developed as a golf course. The barn was destroyed and its stone was slated to become a foundation for a clubhouse. This is the last known photograph of the Fissel barn, taken days before it was destroyed. The pile of blood-stained wood of the hospital barn was hauled away within hours after this footage was shot. Today, the burial area in hospital fields where many wounded laid in agony is fairways and putting greens. Another historic site is now gone forever. A U.S. Christian Commission map locates a Confederate hospital camp just west across the White Run on the Aaron Shealy farm. Aaron Shealy was a schoolteacher in Gettysburg and remembered a Union soldier playing his piano as he walked into his occupied house. His favorite pocket watch was stolen, and his farmland was littered with Confederate prisoners. Southwest of the Baltimore Pike, this area was taken over by General Messina Patrick, the Provost Marshal of the Army of the Potomac, and made this barn his headquarters. These fields occupied by Confederate prisoners saw tragedy as the hard-driving July rains flooded the nearby stream and many wounded prisoners were swept downstream and drowned. In 1998, plans were made to turn this area into a shopping mall. 1 year later, the historic integrity of the earth was now permanently destroyed. Today, grounds that once heard the moans and cries of the wounded heroes of the South are now part of the concrete and asphalt jungle of development, as a large shopping mall now stands on this hallowed ground. A map of the hospital area tells the story in the middle of the shopping complex. Camp Letterman General Hospital was established in order to bring the remaining Union and Confederate wounded to one location. The camp was established 3 miles east of town on York Pike. The 400-tent hospital was located near railroad tracks and streams and remained in operation until November of 1863. In 1997, earth was again moved as another shopping complex rose to occupy the same ground of this historic hospital. The land surrounding the actual site is now a mobile home park, and the administration area of the hospital remains for sale.